This recording is for the Dixon Public Library. Today is November 4th, 1998. I'm with Evelyn Dutra in Evelyn's home in Dixon, California. And of course we're going to talk about Dixon. And that's Gus there, sitting on your lap. Now, let's start with some family history. Your last name is Dutra, but your maiden name is Webb. How did the Webbs get here? What family history do you know about? Do you know about the Webbs before they came here?
I don't know much about the Webbs. If I remember right, most of them were from Meigs County in Meigs County in Ohio. Mm-hmm. Although we lived in, I think it was Fairfield County in Lancaster. We came from Lancaster, Ohio, which was near Columbus. And what brought us to California was the Depression. My father, we didn't know we were Depression children, but my father couldn't find work. He was a young railroad man. I can't even remember what railroad. It seems to me it was Baltimore, Ohio. And there was no work for the young men, and so we came out to Dixon, California, because my grandfather had a small chicken ranch, and my aunt, Faye Dawson, had a larger chicken ranch, and my father went to work for the Dawsons. And we made our home with my grandmother and grandfather, which was George and Martha Webb. Can't remember just what year they came to Dixon, probably at the beginning of the Depression. And they were from Canada at that time, originally from Ohio, but they had lived in different, I think my grandfather was a teacher besides a salesman, so they had lived in various states before they settled in Canada. And I had only met my grandfather once when he came east to see us. I think it was one time. And then my grandmother, I didn't meet her until after my brother Bob had polio, and we went to Canada to find a doctor to help him because he was left with a paralyzed arm. And my grandfather thought that there was a specialist in Calgary that could help him. So anyhow, we were moving to a strange little town. A bunch of teary-eyed kids when we arrived on May 3rd, 1930. It was the Mayfair weekend. Of course, we missed that because we came in late on Saturday night. And I can remember thinking when my father told me an untruth, because he said we were going to the land of sunshine and oranges, and it was raining cats and dogs, so that was the first thing that upset us. And I guess it was meant to be, because we lived with my grandmother and grandfather. My dad worked for Marianne, Mrs. Dawson, and later various other jobs in Dixon, but it was meant to be because my grandfather passed away the following year, very suddenly, and Dad, being the only son, took over the chicken ranch. There was a small business right behind the Anderson Elementary School now. And then that started our life in Dixon, and we kids, one thing about being Depression kids, we all learned to work and worked at various jobs. My one brother, Robert, the one that had polio, later moved to Woodland, but he retired from a motor vehicle and a state job. And my brother, Don, which is known as Spiderweb, he worked for the original Mace. After he got out of the service, he worked for Macy's, which was a meat processing plant. And my brother Paul worked at various jobs and then retired from the University of Davis. And my sister Ruth married and went to Woodland and took over a restaurant that my mother had had there during the war. We grew up around a family restaurant in a small ranch, and amazingly, we all stayed in the same area. And later, I married a native Dixonite, so I didn't get very far. I got out of town to Pedrick Road, where I'm still living. And my children have all been raised in Dixon. And all of them have stayed here, except one son that went into business in San Francisco. And I thought at the beginning when he went in the service we'd lose him to Southern California, but he still came back to Northern California. And other than that, my husband farmed, and we raised our children on the Dutra Ranch. And I've always said if we were taxed off of the property because they're developing all around us, so I will always be grateful that I raised my family in the country around Dixon. There was no better place to raise kids.
Now, what about when you were a kid? Now, you were raised on a chicken ranch?
On a chicken ranch in town then. Now there's a lot of controversy about cats and dogs, but we were on a chicken ranch right in town. My father had, and my grandfather had, white-legged chickens. And we sold the eggs, and he also had pigeons. He always kept about 3,000, about 1,500 pair of pigeons. In those days, squabs brought a tidy price, and that's how we made our living. And then all of us went to school in Dixon. Some went on to college and came back to Dixon. And my first job out of high school was the telephone company, and I only worked a short time, and then I got sick, so I didn't work anymore until my youngest girl. Get down, Gus. Don't bother people. Come on. I didn't work anymore until my youngest daughter was about 2 years old, and I went to work at the Nut Tree, which was a good job for me because I had learned the restaurant business around my mother's small restaurant in Dixon. She went into business in Dixon. I think she was in business about 10 years in Dixon, and then when the highway changed, the man that had a large truck stop in Woodland built her a restaurant in Woodland so she could still cater to her truck drivers.
So now your father was raising chickens and pigeons, and your mother had a restaurant.
My mother had a restaurant.
What was the name of that restaurant?
It was the original Normandy Cafe, and it was right where Don Johnson's rest home is now, and the little English two-door restaurant that was on Highway 40 at the time has been moved down the street. And it was a real estate office, but I think it's a beauty shop now. But that building is still standing.
Now you say she had to move because the highway came.
Yes, I can't remember. Well, it was in about 1940. The way I can remember that date is my oldest boy was little, because he was born in 41, so that's about the time she went to Woodland. And that was because we were cutting off the Highway 40. It was going to be Interstate 80. And Highway 40 then is what's North Adams Street now. Adams Street was the old highway. And of course there was a lot of business for a truck stop in those days, but then when the highway changed and her business was mostly, well, a lot of tourists too, but of course the tourist trade was not as much as it is now. And so A.W. Hayes built this restaurant for my mother in Woodland. And he was part of, well, there's still a museum in Woodland that he has all his antique trucks and things, and maybe, I think they've consolidated with another group up there on farm.
I was there 2 weeks ago, the Hayes Hydric Agricultural
Yeah,
Center,
I read in the paper, I know the Hayes boys well, but I haven't been back since their father died. In fact, they used to have A.W. Hayes' birthday parties out at the museum, so he was very fond of my mother.
Her daughter, or his daughter, Linda, works out there. I'm sure it was. Is that right? Hayes had a daughter named Linda?
Possibly.
Yeah.
I didn't know the girl, I just knew the boys because they had their shop right behind my mother's restaurant. So I became very well acquainted with the boys.
It's an interesting place. There's a lot of Dixon farm equipment that's up there.
Oh yeah, there is.
Quite a bit of it, in fact.
I haven't been back since they merged and went in. Well, I guess it's both farm equipment and trucks now.
Right.
Is that the way it is now?
They're kept separately in two buildings next to each other.
Yeah, I haven't been back since then, but
It's an interesting place.
went out many times when it was just the truck museum.
Well, let's talk now about, now you came in 1930.
Yes.
Of course, the depressions and all that. What was life like when you first got to Dixon in 1930?
It was a good life. I just, we lived as I say, there was no places to rent or anything. And I don't know what we would have done. In fact, I was accused of saying at one of the city council meetings that we lived in a tent. That was not true. A lot of people did. A lot of people that came in to work in the crops and things did have to live in tents over around winters and places like that. And my brother was very indignant that it got back to him that I said we lived in a tent. And I said, well, no, I said we would have if it hadn't been for my grandparents. Because they had a nice little home, and that's where we made our home. My dad never bought a house for us because when his dad died, we lived there, and then my grandmother stayed on, and my mother went to work, and my grandmother took care of us kids. And it was a good life.
Now, you kids, of course, well, I assume you helped out around the ranch.
We worked hard. We worked very hard, every one of us. And I've always said maybe that was part of the training we had, because everybody had to work. My mother worked, my grandmother worked, my grandmother took care of pigeons, my mother picked chickens, because when it was time to get the new group of chickens or a flock of chickens, you would buy them, and then you had to cull out the little roosters and keep the laying hens, you know. We picked a lot of chickens and sold them for practically nothing.
Well, what did you do as a 9, 10-year-old little girl? What could you do to help out?
I had to water the pigeons. I helped take care of my brothers and sisters, and helped my grandmother. And when I was 13, I kept books for the California Fruit Express. They had a lettuce shed. I know I was too young that my dad wouldn't let me go to the packing plant, but the man brought the checks, the papers and things to me, and I kept books when I was in the 8th grade for California Fruit Express. And only once did I get to go out to the packing shed. And I think his name was Spencer, and he lived in one of my dad's rentals. And he called and had to get permission from my father for me to bring the checkbook and come out, because he was firing a lot of people. And I can remember making out their paychecks at the lettuce shed that day. And I couldn't have been over 13 or 14 because I was in the 8th grade. And then all the time I was in high school, I worked in my mother's restaurant. By this time she had the Normandy Cafe. And I worked in her restaurant all through high school.
You were a waitress there?
I was a waitress, cook, scrub lady, whatever had to be done. I was too young to sell beer, so whenever I worked the evening shift, usually there was somebody on that was over 21. But if I had to work by myself at night or something, my dad had a cot in the storeroom, and he would come out and sell the beer, because you had to be very careful. And I was never allowed to touch the beer or wine. And usually I'd work a late shift or something. See if you can get that fly, Susan, it's annoying. But anyhow, then, I don't know, when I graduated from high school, of course my dream was to go on to college, but I got a job at the telephone company. I graduated on Friday night and went to work for Pacific Bell on just a small exchange in Dixon, and I worked there until I was married, and probably would have still been with the telephone company if I hadn't gotten sick. And then I spent that was the days when they isolated you for tuberculosis. And on a school survey they picked up that I had tuberculosis. So I had to go to a county sanatorium.
How old were you when this?
Well, this was about was the first year I was married, so I was between 19 and 20. I got married at 19, so I was about 20 when I went up there. And the only place to go that you couldn't afford to pay was a county sanatorium. It was operated by several counties, and it was quite an experience. I didn't stay long because they didn't find an active germ on me, but I stayed long enough. In those days, my husband couldn't keep up an apartment and everything without me, so he moved home to the ranch right where we are now. And then when I came back in about 6 weeks after they ran all the tests, we made our home here. And then I moved back to town because my father had some rentals and he fixed a place. Because there was nothing to rent in Dixon if you didn't have family. And I'm still running the little rentals that he put on some vacant lot next to our house. That's been my mother's income for the last 25 years. That's the piece of property that I'm trying to develop now because it's beyond me, and I've taken care of it long enough.
Now, you mentioned something I wanted to talk about was the beer at the restaurant. Now, Prohibition lasted until 1933. Do you remember anything about Prohibition?
I didn't remember Prohibition very well. I was 6 years old, and I think every man in Ohio probably made beer to drink. And my father had come to California I can remember my father, what do they call it, home brew. I can remember my father making home brew.
Vicky.
Because they always had their beer. And I was about in the first grade. As I came home from school, there was a lot of cars around the house down the road from where we lived. We lived right on a main street in Lancaster, Ohio. So did you get Leather's Road?
Yeah.
So I didn't mention this to my folks, but what had happened, my father came to California. This is the young
your
man.
mother now?
Yes, this is my mother. This is the young man that he's getting the history of when we came to California.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my gosh. Get to her
I know
road.
you were right on the third day of
The
May.
third day of May. I told the truth
Yeah,
about
a
that.
rainy day
A
in
rainy
May.
day. Remember us crying because it was land
What
of
was it, 19 what?
1930.
1930.
1930. I've had my mother with me since March. She felt, well, I had her with me a few months when she broke her leg. She has osteoporosis, and her leg broke and she fell. And then this time she fell and broke her arm. So she's getting slower by the day. I can see it, when I'm with her all the time. Her home's in Woodland. Sooner or later we'll take her back, but I have to get help before I can take her back. Anyhow, I was telling you about the Prohibition days
Right.
and what happened. My mother had a cousin who called one night. My father was in California. This is how my father called them dry dicks. I don't know what they were. But they went around and more or less put a sting, I guess it's what you call a sting, on people. And they had been to my mother's cousins and bought beer. I think 25 cents a bottle or something. And when my mother being naive and young, she was probably under 26 when we came to California with 5 children. So this cousin called and wanted to know if there was any beer. Well, of course, my dad had a few bottles of beer that he'd made before he went to California. They didn't sell it, they just had it to drink, like you would homemade root beer or something.
Mm-hmm.
So anyhow, my father got off the train in Lancaster. They picked him up and took him to jail because this cousin had brought these people to my mother's house, and she let them have beer, and they paid her 25 cents a bottle.
Oh.
So you were more or less set up.
Mm-hmm.
And I can remember, I think my dad called and said the fine was $100 or something, and my mother had, mind you, this was tight money, and she had to rake up $100 to go get my dad. So this was the only run-in with the law that I can remember. But I remember thinking, now if I had just told somebody about these people, I felt very guilty at 6 years of age, but of course I didn't know what all these cars, and big fancy cars, and I said, nowadays I think, oh my God, they look like the mafia or something, around this house. I don't know what you could have done about it, but my mother was just beside herself to think that she took money for these beers.
Hmm.
But that's what they did. They went around all over the town, not just my father, but different people and then had him arrested because it was prohibitions. It was the only thing in those days, speakeasies. And you had to have a password or something to get in. I didn't understand all that at 6 years of age, but I later learned because my dad had cousins in college and stuff. That was at the time of the coonskin coats and the roadster cars, because I can remember the boys picking up my cousins, my dad's cousins. And they were from Athens, Ohio, see, a university town. So when they came up to Lancaster to work, I thought, gee, this is great, these fellows in their roadsters, you know. But they all drank, but they got their booze I suppose at a speakeasy or something, I don't know. That was Prohibition days.
Now, well, speaking of Dixon now, you said your family arrived around the time of the Mayfair. What was the Mayfair like when you were
It was
very
more
small?
like a family picnic. It wasn't a carnival or anything. They had a May Queen and they had a little parade, and then everybody took their basket lunches and we had a picnic and they had a dance. I can't remember too much about it until of course I don't remember the first one at all. I can remember my aunt leaving a dance coming to greet us, because she was in high school at the time. I think she was a senior in high school at this time. And for years it was just a small get-together, a one-day thing, and then it grew through years and they started having carnivals. I don't think they even had a merry-go-round when I first went to it. It was more like a family picnic. And they didn't have horse races then. I think they had the buggy races after that, you know, what do they call them?
The ones with just two wheels. I can't think of the name either.
I can't. Mother, do you remember what they called the races? Huh? Can you remember when they had the Mayfair, just like the Lancaster Fair, that they had the horse and buggies where they raced, not, what do they call those? They had a state fair too. Even our state fair was like a family thing.
I've just drawn a blank, but
I have too.
they still do it now. of
Yeah,
course.
they still have them. Can you remember the fairs with the races?
Horse races.
Yeah, but I mean when they had the buggy races. Remember the little, you can't remember what they call them?
Harness race.
Harness, that's it. Harness
Yeah.
races, yeah, because that was, even in Lancaster, that was a big affair. The county
Lancaster
fair.
Fair was the big affair.
Huh?
The Lancaster Fair.
County fair, yeah. 'Cause they always,
County Fair.
that was Fairfield County, right?
Fairfield County Fair.
Well, now Dixon, of course, has got the other parade. It was the Holy Ghost parade.
That was a big event.
Uh-huh.
Much,
What was that like?
much nicer than,
The Holy Ghost, that's a Portuguese.
they always had it was a very religious thing. And
Uh-huh.
my children, my first two children were in the parades, and then after all the older Dutra men, the older Portuguese people, in
I think
fact,
we arrived here in 1930, didn't we? On the 3rd day of May.
yeah, that's right. And then they always had the Portuguese parade and the festival, they called it, in July.
Mhm.
At that, they always fed the people. I can't quite explain the story behind it, but there was a famine in Portugal, and somehow or other, the Queen was in it, because they had a tribute to Queen Isabella. I wish my sister-in-law were here, she could explain it. And they had a queen, a little Portuguese queen, and then they had a junior queen, and a very elaborate costumes and gowns and things that they wore. But that fell through after the older. There wasn't many true Portuguese. We all intermarried. And when the younger generation couldn't, because they worked for wages where most of the older people had their own time and farms, and they donated the meat and everything to barbecue. But they fed multitudes of people.
Mhm.
And everybody was welcome from all the neighboring communities. And they had a barbecue with their beef and their soup, as they called it. They still have it on a smaller scale here in town, which is getting bigger every year because there's a new group taking over. but I always marveled at how many people they could feed, because no one was ever turned away. And then once, during the war, I can remember standing upstairs in the bedroom window crying. My father-in-law had a smaller scale festival out here. We had all the tables and everything on the lawns, but he invited the disabled veterans from Mare Island. And I can remember standing, and I couldn't handle it because there were amputees and boys in wheelchairs. The whole community got together and came out and had this festival. I don't even think there's any pictures, but that was probably 1941 or 40. No, I didn't have gym, so it was 1940. And I can remember my father, I said, well, there'll be plenty of wine, because all the Portuguese people made their, their paper. All these Portuguese people had their wine cellars, you know, they made wine to drink for themselves, but my dad thought these veterans deserved more than just wine, and he came out with a whole armload of bottles of
I remember
booze.
he invaded Dixon. Me, Dad,
We
5
did,
kids.
we did. When we came to Dixon, it was so
Talk about
small.
on passes, because Dad brought the Pennsylvania Railroad.
Pennsylvania, I said Baltimore and Ohio. Was it Pennsylvania Railroad? Oh, see, I'm wrong there. But it was a sad day and a fun day, you know, to see all these people. But they brought a whole busload from Mare Island.
Grandpa Webb just come out here.
Oh, you said, the groups have kind of intermarried, the Portuguese, the Germans.
Oh, yeah. And that, at that time, when I married my husband, there was a racial thing in Dixon. I mean, if you were Italian, you stayed in your group. If you were Portuguese, you were more or less in your group. And it was almost a thing like intermarrying with the blacks now.
Well, I guess religion might have had something to do
The
with it.
Catholics,
Catholics and
yes.
Protestants.
My father wasn't a religious man. I mean, as far as, yes, he had faith and he raised a good.
He wasn't religious, but he was sure fussy.
He was fussy and he was a Christian, really, and probably did more. I always said my dad was better to people that were down and out, as we called it, than he was to his own family, because he knew what it was like. I think his first trip to California, he came out like a hobo on boxcars. He hitchhiked out. And one of my pet stories, my cousin, who you've met, Dorothy Wallace, one time she asked my dad, well, why didn't you go to college like my mother? And he said, well, Dorothy, that's very clear. He said, I was smarter than your mother. About the time he should have been in college, he was riding the freight trains coming out to California. Because I remember him telling, I was going to Oakland. We had an elderly aunt in Oakland. My husband did. And my dad could name off all the streets. As a kid, he had driven taxi in Oakland and San Francisco. So he knew a little bit about California before he brought his family out.
Just a second.
Vicki, please go away.
Okay.
Isn't she a nuisance?
So, let's see. Now, so what were we talking about? We were talking about how your father came out and he didn't go to college and he got here and he was...
He started,
He worked on the Pennsylvania Railroad back east.
and the thing I
When he
admired,
got married.
the thing I admired my father for, because during the Depression, he ran up bills. I mean, he had to feed 5 children. My mother in the East took in roomers or whatever she could do when
We
he was...
owned a grocery bill when we got
Mama,
out here, but he said,
This is all being recorded.
oh,
So when mother, as I say, took in roomers to help pay the bills, the grocery bills, but Dad owed money. I had no idea how much. And I think the wage scale was about $30 a month when we came to California. And I can still see my dad sitting down, whatever payday was, and writing checks to send back for the grocery bill, the dentist bill. We were little, but we always had our teeth fixed and these kind of things. And I think of people now that run up bills and go through bankruptcy almost deliberately. And my father would not think of doing that. He paid all his bills. In fact, the grocery man, now this is a story that was told to me because I wasn't old enough to remember. I remember the man, Clem Brown, he lost his mind. Men committed suicide during the Depression because the pressure of no money and families.
Everybody owed him.
Everybody owed him, and my father paid his grocery bill. I have no idea how much it was, $5, $10 at a time, and sent it to his wife, who also had a big family just like he did. But it never occurred to my father to not pay his bills. He was a stickler.
He was fussy about that.
Yeah, and I can remember when the boys would go in the service or go away to college. My brothers had.
Even a gambling bill, he paid it.
Oh yeah, he liked to gamble. But he
Shake dice.
he liked to shoot crap. I can still see him taking kids' paychecks. And he would take money out of your cash register.
Hello.
Hello, this is my son Steve. I don't know that you've met
Hello,
him.
Steve.
Paul, he's getting some information on research.
I had a guy that he called me from British Columbia, a Dutra,
What do you
looking
want?
for Steve Dutra as well. You got. I'm Steve Dutra, but there's a whole bunch of us.
Uh-huh.
And he was one of the one I go by Petaluma.
Oh, was
you got
there a
the wrong-
Steve over there?
There's 4 or 5 of them. One Napa, one Steve, one Sacramento, one
All Steve's.
all Steves.
I didn't
Well,
think
I
I
was
picked
Steve.
such a common name.
Yeah. What time did you call me last night?
9:30.
I was out of it. When
I'm
did you-
so sorry.
Don't worry about it. I'm usually awake, but I just had too many things going on.
How's your head?
Still hurts.
Still
I'm able
hurts.
to function now, but I'm on a rush. I'm trying to get done before I leave.
Where are we going now?
Vegas.
Oh, bless you.
Okay, your son just came in with some news. Now we're back filming again. Yeah, I wanted to talk a little about what we were talking before, the different groups here, the Portuguese, the Germans. Now, you mentioned we got a lot of flies in the kitchens because there's dairies next
Yes.
door. Now, everybody says the Portuguese were into dairies, and the
Portuguese
Germans were into dry farming. And
In this area, I don't know the nationality of the farmers around here, but mostly dairies were Portuguese dairies. On my north, there was the Sequeira dairy. And then on the next road, there was the Mizoracas, and there was Dutra's, Dr. Dutra's parents had a dairy at one time. And I think when my father-in-law came to this country, as I said before, he came from the island of Pico. He landed in Benicia because he had a sister there, and he worked in a tannery in Benicia till he could get enough money to come up to around Dixon and start a dairy. And they started it on rented property, and then they bought parcels of land. Very conservative people, and worked hard. And my father-in-law bought 3 different parcels of land by the time he passed away. Not big acreages, but like 40 acres at a time, and then there was 80 acres here. And that's all they ever did. When he got sick, then they had to go to town. My mother-in-law invested in some rental property, so that took care of them when they sold the ranch to us. And we kept this ranch because the other kids inherited the smaller places. There was more land here, so we paid his brother and sister off and lived here. And most of the people around here have done the same thing. The land is handed down to, family members. It was bought when it was inexpensive. Now you can't afford to buy land here. Unless you're a big farm operator, like the man that farms for us. They've acquired a lot of acreage because they do it on shares. But their father the grandfather and father was a dairyman too to begin with. But there's not that many dairies in this country now. I can't tell you much more about that.
well, the other big thing is sheep.
Sheep, that's what my dad too. Besides working a chicken ranch, he always raised a few sheep. And at one time, this was probably the sheep center of California.
Hmm.
And then, of course, after irrigation come in and they started row cropping, then they the sheep, there wasn't that much land, you know, to feed, because that was mostly pasture that they fed. In fact, we had sheep when we first came out here, because this place was set up in little sections to just keep moving cows to pasture. And then later we put it in alfalfa. But you couldn't do that unless you had water, so thank God we have Monticello, Lake Berryessa and Monticello Dam. My father-in-law would turn over in his grave if he knew what it cost for the taxes now compared to when they signed for it. It would be unbelievable. But he thought that was, I like west of town. They have the open ditches, you know, from Monticello for the water. Well, he was a stickler. He fought for the underground water here because he didn't believe in those ditches because he was afraid people would drown, and they have. See, they're all cement. Kids think they're safe to get in there, but he fought it all the way to have the open ditches on this side because he knew that eventually we'd move out here. We had small children, and he didn't want that. And then, of course, there's a lot of evaporation too with open ditches, so they were progressive enough to think ahead about things like this.
So he was successful in fighting the open ditch.
Well, all of them along here did. See, all our pipes are underground here.
Wow.
Because I remember when this girl was here today, she was a toddler, and she had a boxer, not this one, but a dog. And one day she came in and she was walking around, I guess, out here. We didn't realize she got that far away, and she came in to tell her dad, come on, she wanted to take him and show him something. So he took her by the hand and they started walking. And in between our place and the neighbors, they had an open pipe and there was no cap on it. But she wanted to show her dad where the water was. Well, it was big enough. If she'd have fallen in there, I mean, it was capped. Well, not that day, but the next day. He was furious, but you wouldn't think a little girl would go that far. You read about these things in the paper, but you don't think they'll happen to you. We always said we let her have a dog because even if she walked in the field, we could find her because you know where the dog was. She was that small. So that was one of the things that, well, they slipped up on it. They should have had a cap on it.
Yeah.
And the pipe's still out there with those trees.
Well, now, we talked a little bit about farming. We should talk a bit about businesses in Dixon. Of course, your mother had a
My
restaurant.
mother had a restaurant business.
What were some of the other businesses?
Oh, we had a nice little downtown area. We had a lumber yard, or a dry good, what do you call it? Hardware store.
Hardware.
And there were several nice bars, which there still is. And our banks. We had a store where you could buy clothes and shoes. A very nice dress
It was
shop.
10 years I ran this restaurant in Dixon, and I fed all the trucks that go through. You know. Then they changed the highway to 80, and then Hop Hayes had a bunch of trucks, and he knew me so well, so he built me a restaurant in Woodland. So I come to Woodland.
He's familiar with the museum up there where they have the trucks and hybrids, the farm equipment.
Yeah, I think his son's got a museum.
But see, we don't have a downtown shopping area anymore like we used to have. Of course, your malls and things have taken over, and the discount stores and all these things have taken over where people just drive a little distance to shop, which is a shame because it takes money out of Dixon. We have nice grocery stores, but we only have one drugstore now.
You don't have a theater. No, you had a theater
We
in the
had a
past.
nice theater. We don't have a theater anymore. There's nothing really for the young people.
I know you were awfully busy working as a kid, but when you did have some free time, what would a little kid do for fun? I guess the movies is one.
Movie was the only thing I remember because my dad we always got paid for working, a few cents. But we didn't get allowances. But Friday night was payday for us. And whether we picked up walnuts, whether we fed chickens, or and by our age we got paid. And I think movies were a dime then. So we could always have enough for a treat, go to the movies. In fact, I worked at the theater, even though I worked in my mother's restaurant. till 9 o'clock. Then I would go up and work at the theater for a second show. I got my ticket. I don't think I was paid very much, but I'd close up the theater. I don't know how I did it now. I guess that's why I got sick, because I was going to high school and working and worked till 9 o'clock in the restroom. Then I'd go up and see a movie and close up the theater till 11 o'clock. Then
You were in high school at the time?
yeah, and I worked every other night. My mother, there was a family living close to us that their mother was ill and their father had deserted them. And there was no welfare or anything, to my knowledge, in those days. I mean, you had to work. And these girls were being raised by their grandmother, just like we were. My mother was working, but my grandmother was home with us, and their grandmother was home with him. And so my mother we worked every other night. We shared our little, what did we work for? 50 cents a night. The wage scale was $1 a day. But Mother would say, well, they need money too.
I paid $1 a day for a cook.
I know.
But I had the rest.
I know. See, this was in the 30s, so.
That Violet used to cook for me, and Grandma Grandy.
Now, you mentioned high school. I wanted to talk about high school. You went to Dixon High?
Dixon High,
What was that like?
It was small. I think in our graduating class, we only had 30-some students graduate. And let's see, I didn't go to school in the new school because I graduated. Our last year of high school was when they tore down the old high school and built a new one. And we had, they partitioned off the gymnasium. And we went our senior year that way, if I remember right. So I think the school was built probably the new one about 1940.
Now, when that was under construction, you were having classes in the gymnasium?
In the gymnasium. And then we had, it was classrooms, so we had to graduate at the fairgrounds. I remember that. It was a very cold night. But I think my brother Robert, the one that retired from motor vehicle, now he said he went to all the schools. He was in the old school, then in the gymnasium, then he went his senior year in the new high school, if I remember right.
You mentioned your brothers as being some pretty good athletes. Did they play baseball?
And no, they played mostly football. Well, they played
Football.
baseball, I'm sure, but they were both football players.
Mhm.
Paul played for,
Paul and Don both.
yeah.
But Bob, he never,
Well, Bob couldn't because,
he had a paralyzed arm.
but
They played Dixon High School.
Dixon High School, they were both good players. I can't remember too much about it because, well, see, I was married at that time because I left home at 19 and they were younger, so they were in high school. I remember going to the games. But
So I guess sporting events and...
that was it, shows.
What about dances now
Oh,
as
we
a
had
high
lots
school?
of dances.
Those are pretty important.
We had lots of dances and social things at school. All our social activities were based around family and school.
Family and school.
Family and school. And then a few of us belonged to like Rainbow Girls. That was a branch of the Mason and Eastern Star. But we didn't have enough kids in town to have an organization here. They had it with Vacaville. So if you were accepted, and they had lodges. People belonged to Native Daughters and for the older women, that church groups and the Native Daughters, Pocahontas. There were quite a few lodges. The men belonged to the Shriners, the Oddfellows, that type of thing. My husband wasn't interested in the lodges. It was too much ritual for him. He didn't care for it. He'd rather work. And I can remember saying to him when I worked at the Nut Tree, well, let's rent the ranch out and buy a home in Leisure Town. This time our kids were married and gone. And I said, I can go across the road, across the freeway to work, and you can enjoy yourself. Because he had retired. He was a few years older. Oh, he said, do you think I'm going to go down there and knock a golf ball around that golf course? He said, I'd rather be out here fixing fences. So even when I retired at 65, I worked 2 days a week because I couldn't stand the sun, and he loved to fish. So he had 2 days to fish, and then the rest of the time we worked. But until his heart went bad, and then he couldn't even go out alone to do that.
Well, now, I know we're supposed to talk about Dixon, but you spent a lot of time down at the nut tree. I talked with May Azevedo, who
Yes,
also
she
worked
was
there
my
for a long
supervisor
while.
down there.
Well, tell us briefly about the nut tree and what went on down there.
The Nuttery was a fabulous restaurant, I thought. Of course, I grew up around a small family restaurant, and it was family, even though it was on bigger scale. They were great people to work for. And of course, they had to have their rules, and a lot of people disobeyed them. But it was strictly business. Everything was business down there. They served quality food. They tried to have, I don't say quality help, but they trained their help well before they ever met up with the public, which most restaurants don't do. They put you on tell you what was on the menu, and they put you to work. But they give you training and everything before you even met up with their customers. I didn't get in on that. I trained a lot of girls after I was there, but
Were a lot of these people from Dixon?
a lot of them were from surrounding small towns, girls from women, and a lot of them Travis Air Force wives and things that were, because when Travis men were in the service, they lived there, the girls were idle, and I met a lot of nice women that traveled with the Air Force. In fact, I still correspond with some.
I was in Old Normandy 10 years, then Pop Hayes built me a restaurant in Woodland.
Yeah, I told him all that, Mother. So, there isn't much to say about the Nuttery, but thrived for a good many years. And then the competition, I think, was one thing. And family problems. Excuse me, I have to answer my phone.
Okay. Okay, we're back. We just had a little phone call. Well, we were talking about the nut tree, and
Well, I said it was a nice place to work, and I enjoyed it for a good many years. I said for somebody that started out to work 6 months to straighten my daughter's teeth, I wound up staying 34. We had just started farming, and my husband said, well, go borrow some more money and get her teeth done. I said, no, I'm going to go to work. And I saw May Azevedo in the store one day, or on the street or something, and I said, May, do they ever hire part-time help down there? And she said, oh, yes. And I said, well, I need a job, and I will come down and put in it. She said, come down and put in an application. So I did. A friend of mine that wanted to go to work too, we went down and put in our applications. And I think the next day they called me, and the lady said, come, Mary Helen, the daughter of the family that owned the nut tree, called and said, Evelyn, you want a job? And I said, yes, but I've got a small girl. I don't think I can work very much, but I'd like part-time or evenings or something. She said, come down and pick up your uniform. And I said, well, I can't. My hair's in curlers and all this and that. And she said, that doesn't make any difference. So I really wasn't interviewed. I went to work, and I said, well, I promise you I'll stay 6 months. And I stayed 34 years. So you know it was a nice place to work, or I wouldn't have lasted that long. But it worked in fine with my family. And they used to kid me. I'd serve a lot of lunches. People from the university, where I live just 6 miles from the campus, and they keep saying, oh, Evelyn, you're working too hard, you need to come over and work with us. And I put my application in there, but it didn't work with a family. You had to be gone 8 hours a day and 5 days a week. So I put in my time at the nut tree and enjoyed it immensely. The only thing, you had to work Sundays. And even our ministers in town, when we'd wait on their parties or their groups, they would kid us about getting our religion at the nut tree on Sunday, because that was a must. When you went to work, you had to work holidays and Sundays, which I did.
Well, now back to Dixon. Couple of big changes, I guess, are the moving on the highway and the railroad. The railroad, I forget who told me this, but they said, well, nowadays they don't even blow the whistle, and they used to stop several times
Oh,
a day.
yes, we had a regular station here. In fact, the depot that was tore down, my oldest boy always said, "Mother, buy that."
Part of the depot?
Yeah, well, it was up for sale.
Hmm.
He said it would make a darling restaurant. He wanted to get me back in the restaurant business. And it would have been something like, there's one down there with box cars. What do they call it down on the highway?
I don't know.
Fairfield. I can't think of the name of it, but it's all, I've been there just a few times. They have like an antique store there and a restaurant. And you're served right in the boxcars.
Well, you know, May Azevedo, I think her son had the idea of opening a restaurant on top of the grain towers.
Oh, yes. Well, my boy was that way. He was kind of ahead of his time for Dixon, and he'd say, "Mom, you could make the cutest restaurant out of that station, you know." And there was parking there because it's right back by our lumber company, and they've made a lot of parking there. And it would have been a historical place because that's where we arrived in Dixon.
That's
you
too
know.
bad. Either a restaurant or a museum of Dixon.
Oh, I could
That
have.
would
I
have been a
could
nice
have.
place.
You know, at the time, I don't know whether I had the money. I never even checked. But I said, "Oh gosh, Jim, you tie yourself down." And I look around all these small towns now. There's so many little antique stores. Everything you can't rent, they're taking those and reselling. There's nothing left to buy for people, including my mother. And I've always said, maybe someday I'll have a little store. In fact, I have a niece that has a little antique store in Dixon, and I guess they're doing very well.
Well, now, as far as transportation goes, the railroad was pretty important.
Very important.
But what were roads like when you were very small? I guess outside of town they were just dirt roads, were they?
Well, this road was gravel, and the reason I can remember...
I mean Pedrick Road.
Pedrick Road was gravel, and I wasn't nearly old enough to get my license, which I think was 15 and a half even then. But when I left my mother's restaurant that was on Highway 40, we had the old Cargill, well later it was Cargill Mill there in Dixon, and I had to walk and I had to carry money home. And my dad, because I had the receipts for the night and stuff, I'd have to bring money. And my dad really didn't like me walking at night and carrying money. And as I say, I started to work in the restaurant when I was 13 or 14. About 14, I guess, because I had worked for the lettuce packing shed when I was 13. So I was just in high school, and my dad gave me a Model A. And he said, "Now learn to drive this." He gave me a few lessons. So in the mornings, if I worked all night, then I'd come out and practice on this road. And it was gravel. And when I'd make U-turns, a couple of times I almost tipped it over, right down here where it's Ron Road now. Because I was on my own, just learning to drive, and I was stopping and starting and making U-turns. So then when I was old enough for a license, but I drove without a license at night to get home from work because it was safer than walking. At that time there was a lot of, I don't know what, the hobos I guess they call them. They slept in around the mill and then right along the tracks. In fact, we kids used to go over and have stew with them once in a while. Hobo stew where they cook it in cans.
You would have a meal with the hobo?
Oh, yes, yes. We weren't allowed to, but we did. From where we lived, there was tracks, you see, just down the road, and my brothers and I would go over and have something to eat with them. And I always remember my dad, during the Depression, never turned anybody away if they were hungry. And, I always said they had our place marked because we had so many people that would come to the door and want a meal. Of course, my grandmother cooked for hired men and all these kids, so there was always something to eat. But you wouldn't dare do that now. And I think of all the types of people that my father hired to work. Most of them were drinkers, and we called them winos. But they never bothered the kids. I mean, I can still I have books and things where hired men have brought me gifts and things. And they were the type of people that worked Then they'd go off and drink, and then they'd come back. But that's the only kind
Dad
of...
used to front me every time I give the man a quarter to buy a drink because he was so sick from drinking, you know. And he said he was so sick he needed to drink so bad, and I gave him a quarter to buy a drink.
Well, that was part of the era we lived in. These men, you know, that down and out and drinking. Well, they still do. In the cities, you see a lot of that, but you don't get that in a small town anymore.
Yeah, things have changed,
Well, I
and
can
people
remember-
don't remember the past.
I can remember I was married because I had Jim in the stroller standing by the tracks in town, and there was a hobo sitting on a boxcar. And he hollered, "Hello, Miss Webb, hello, Miss Webb." Now, it must have worked for
It
my
worked.
dad, but I was married and had a little boy and was standing there, and this man recognized me and hollered, "Hello, Miss Webb." So it must have been somebody that had worked for my dad. And you know, so many of these men were very talented as far as building fences and repair work and that kind of thing. It's just like your prisons that have talented artists and everything, you know. These men were good ranch help, but they had drinking problems. Remember the time that Dad couldn't take us Christmas shopping in Sacramento, and he had, his name was Shirley's, all I remember. He drove us to Sacramento and then got drunk. And here we were up there, all 5 kids, and my mother barely knowing how to drive. She had to drive us home because he never showed up to pick us up. But that was an experience when we were kids.
Well, I guess we've talked about a lot of things about Dixon, but what would you tell somebody today? You know, kids don't quite have a clear picture of the past. Of course, nobody ever could, but I mean, unless they live there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what do we forget to talk about here as far as Dixon goes? What would you want to add to this?
The only thing I can say is all we hear is there's nothing for children, young people. They're lost. And we didn't have all these extra things, but we never felt deprived because we didn't have bowling alleys and skating rinks and all these things. We skated on the street. We played basketball, all the sports and things at school. And I guess the only reason the only really entertainment we had was through churches and schools and going to movies. And I don't understand kids now, and we worked, so that took up our time. By the time you studied, there was no time for mischief, you know, and that's what amazes me now. These kids can't find things to do. We had chores to do. We had lawns to mow. We had chicken houses to clean. And I could still, we had...
No chickens.
Yeah, we had fig trees. We used to sell figs. The kids would pick figs, little buckets of them, and sell them. And of course, we had our pet customers that tipped us well. I mean, we got a dime or something extra. But we eked out a living. And I can remember my brother, when he was little and had polio, picking up walnuts. And then my dad didn't have to go pick them up because he couldn't handle a big sack with one on an arm. And he'd take his wagon, pick up walnuts, and he would not leave those walnuts until my dad came to pick them up.
That was out on Doyle's Lane, wasn't it?
Because that was a quarter for a sack of walnuts. Now I can't even bribe a kid to come out and pick up walnuts if they get $2 or $3 a sack for them. It's funny that kids don't think that's any money anymore. Just like you see the litter of all the cans and stuff. They won't recycle because that's just a few cents, you know. But we did all that as kids. Take back your Coke bottles and get your nickels and that stuff instead of
My
throwing.
mom still picks up cans and things.
Oh yeah, instead of throwing them along the road, you know. And that's the thing, it irritates me that we had to do all this. And that's why I miss my children now, people littering along the road. I'm the only one out here now that can go out and pick up my frontage road. Every Saturday, my kids had to go out and pick up all the trash that people threw along the road, because that's my front yard. And you don't find people respectful young people aren't taught to be respectful of other people's property. And I don't ever remember kids deliberately going out and destroying things. They were proud of their homes and their community. And now you see all the graffiti and where they're building the new houses back on my brother and sister's property. As soon as they put up the cement wall and got it painted, there was graffiti all over it. And I think it's such a shame that kids are not taught to respect how much work it is to do these things. I went to the bank one day. Now some kid had to be on top of our First Northern Bank, and there was graffiti on the top of the bank where they had leaned over. Now, what kind of kids do this? It's, I'd have had mine up there scrubbing it off if I knew they did that, you know. But it's really, it's just a different era, I guess. I don't know how to put it.
Yeah. Well, at least we have this interview, and we're going to have more than 30 others. It might be a little bit of help. People remember the past and connect together. Dixon's a town. So.
Yeah, the things that we look forward to, the social things like the Mayfair and the Portuguese picnic and all these things, because that's about all there was.
Yeah.
And,
well, I just want to thank you for stopping and spending a little time talking about that.
well, I hope I've been of help. I don't know if it's anything interesting.
Well,
I
every
look
little
back
bit,
and it seems pretty dull at times, but as I said before, I've always been grateful that I could raise my family here instead of having to go to a city or something.
Well, we're grateful to hear from you, from you and from your mother. So just want to say thanks for taking a little time to talk.
You're welcome.